I'm Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude Magazine's weekly ADHD Experts webinar broadcast. Welcome to all of you in attendance today, listening in. Our topic today is the brain-behavior connection in children with attention deficit disorder, and our guest speaker is Dr. Joel Nigg. Research on the neurobiological underpinnings of ADHD has really exploded over the last 20 years, and our understanding of how the brain pays attention and how the brain processes information and how this is different between children with ADHD and without ADHD has improved substantially. And we've learned a lot, and we've learned that the neurobiology of ADHD is not the same for all children despite the diagnosis. So we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Nigg as our speaker. He is a clinical psychologist and a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Oregon Health and Sciences University, that's OSHU, in Portland, Oregon, where he directs the ADHD research program and is also director of the Division of Psychology. He's the author of What Causes ADHD, Understanding What Goes Wrong and Why, as well as almost 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers related to the neuropsychological, cognitive, and temperamental correlates of child ADHD, and also MRI-based research and the theoretical interpretations of brain development in ADHD. In today's talk, Dr. Nigg will discuss how the ADHD brain develops, how attention works in the brain, why some kids can pay lots of attention to a video game but not a lecture at school, how emotions processed by the ADHD brain, how the ADHD brain's structural volume and white matter differs from neurotypical ADHD brains, and why we should see the ADHD brain as a partially built communications network and what that means for treating it. Dr. Nigg, thank you so much for joining us today. We are very grateful for your time. I would also like to thank the sponsor of today's webinar, who is Fast Forward. It is the original brain and training intervention proven by research at Stanford and MIT and Harvard to address reading problems by targeting memory, attention, and speed. With Fast Forward and a remote tutor helping every step of the way, your child may see change in as little as 2 months. For more information, please visit www.fastforwardhome.com. That's Fast Forward. Let me just mention, for those of you who may be new to the Attitude webinar series, how they work. Dr. Nigg will speak for some 20 to 30 minutes, present a slide presentation. During that time, post your questions in the box on your screen. Your participation is anonymous. Dr. Nigg will take your questions after he finishes the slide presentation, as many as we have time for. And if you have any problems hearing us, which could happen, the best solution is to dial in via your phone line. This is an internet-based broadcast, and as such, problems stem from internet connections. If you'd like to take notes or download Dr. Nigg's presentation, you can do so now. In your control panel, in the handout section, you'll find a download of the slides. Or if you want to listen to the broadcast again, or sometimes people have a teacher or a spouse or a family member listen, you'll find a complete replay of the webinar along with the slides on the Attitude website, attitudemag.com/webinars. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Nigg with our thanks again.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you, everybody. I'm going to today just hit a few key points on the very rich and interesting and fascinating area of brain research in ADHD. This area has exploded with all kinds of new neuroimaging tools, electrical signal recording, and developmental studies and longitudinal studies. So there are just thousands and thousands of articles, hundreds coming out every year. And so I'm going to hit a few of the key themes and try to focus it on how to understand ADHD's behavioral and attention problems in light of the brain development. So I'll first do a quick summary of neuroscience basics just to orient those of you that don't have much familiarity with the brain. I'm going to present a way of understanding ADHD and self-regulation in terms of top-down, bottom-up signaling in the brain. We'll talk about attention circuits, emotion circuits, and the conception as well as the data on those, and then we'll talk about individual variation. As Susan mentioned, there's quite a bit of differentiation within ADHD on these different brain findings. And I will also touch on some of the real-world examples, for example, some of the behavioral anomalies, like why they can pay attention sometimes but not other times. So happy to have you all join us, and we'll be happy to look at your questions. I'll try to finish closer to 20 than 30 if I can, so there's plenty of time for questions. All right, so the first thing I just want to orient you guys to, once I get control of my screen here, is the question of how does the brain supposed to work? What is the brain? And let's just take a quick look at a couple of points there. First of all, just to orient you all, and this brain looks like this. I think my version was a landscape and these are not, so I apologize for the squishing of this brain. This is not quite the right shape, but there's several major lobes in the cortex on the right-hand side there. Much of what you'll hear about with ADHD involves the frontal lobe, and especially the prefrontal cortex, which is the area closest to the front. But if you take a side view of the brain, you also see important areas below the cortex, within the interior of the brain, the basal ganglia, the limbic system, and even the cerebellum down there toward the back of the brain are very important parts of the brain that we want to understand. And part of what is going on in ADHD is connections. All these parts are connected to each other. They're all connected, and the connections are part of the problem. And so we will come back to that in a second. So when we look at how the brain works at the cellular level, between each of these regions of the brain, there are connections among different neurons, both within and among brain regions. And the way the neurons are set up, there are cell bodies, and you'll hear about gray matter volumes, which is the amount of neurons in the brain. And in ADHD, we have a little bit of a reduced, about 10% reduction in the gray matter volume in the brain globally. And this may be due to fewer neurons or to smaller neurons. This is still being disputed and studied. But the other big discovery in the last 5 or 10 years is that the connections between the neurons, called the axons, are changed. And so all the neurons connecting with these axons, those form networks of connections. And around the axons, as the child matures, grows the white matter, the myelin sheath. And this develops all the way into the 20s. So all the way through adulthood, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, that myelin sheath is growing and maturing. And what that does, essentially, that's like replacing your internet dial-up telephone line with a fiber optic cable. It makes the neural transmission much faster and much more efficient. And their findings in ADHD cognition is that they process information more slowly. And their information processing is noisier than other children, and it's beginning to become clear that this is probably related to immaturity of their myelin fibers around the axons, causing less efficient neural transmission between certain brain circuits. And so this connection is a key part of what we want to be mindful of as we think about how the brain's supposed to function. In ADHD, have several circuits that are involved. In this slide now, the front of the brain is now to the left. Frontal cortex, upper left there, you'll see with a light blue. And other key parts of the brain are labeled here, the parietal cortex, the basal ganglia down in the purple there, the thalamus. The nucleus accumbens is an important area for reward functioning and motivation. And the important point in this slide is that there are complex circuits that are now increasingly well mapped, that are very specified and differentiated within the brain, that link these key brain nodes. Frontal cerebellar circuit, as you can see, linking frontal cortex and the cerebellum down the lower right there. The executive network, which is linking the frontal and parietal network, as well as the subcortical areas, as well as an attention network that is displayed with the green arrows there. And so each of these networks is a candidate for being a locus of dysfunction in ADHD. And one of the major disputes in the field is whether all of these circuits are disrupted or only some of them, and whether we're seeing a generalized inefficiency in the brain or whether we're seeing a particular inefficiency in certain circuits. And a great deal of the energy right now in brain imaging is to try to figure that out. What we think in our lab is that we actually have a bit of both going on. We have subgroups of ADHD kids with breakdowns in different ones of these circuits showing slightly different surface symptoms. And I'll show you some evidence around that here as we go along. But what I'm going to do now is break each of these circuits down and talk about what they're actually doing that might help explain ADHD symptoms. So how does it work in practice? And when we look at this front and back and up and down aspect of the brain, what does that mean? Well, we think about this in terms of top-down and bottom-up signaling. And you can think about how the brain is involved in self-regulation as something like a teeter-totter. The signaling from the back of the brain to the front of the brain and from the interior to the brain to the outer part of the brain is bottom-up signaling. Those signals tend to respond from the bottom up because they're responding to sensory input. They're responding to what you see and hear and immediately triggering attentional capture or emotional reaction. In response, the top-down signals come from neurons projecting from the prefrontal cortex backward toward the back of the cortex or projecting downward into the interior of the brain to modulate those spontaneous signals. And those top-down modulatory signals are based on your goals, on your learning, on what you want to be doing. And so if I suddenly feel anxious about somebody walking into the room, that spontaneous response to that stimulus is a bottom-up reaction from my interior of my brain. But I can then, a moment later, have a deliberate response where I decide I'm going to set that feeling aside and not worry about it. I have to focus on my talk or my reading. And then I can suppress that emotion deliberately. I can similarly bias what I notice around me. If I'm focusing on my computer right now, I'm not going to notice the noise outside because my top-down goals are suppressing some of that signaling. At least that's how it's supposed to work normally. So on the left-hand side of the graph, what we see here is a good balance of bottom-up and top-down signaling. The bottom-up systems appropriately interrupt my attention when something important happens around me that I should notice. Somebody draws near to me physically, or a loud sound, or the teacher, if I'm a child, the teacher frowns, and that wasn't supposed to happen right now, so my bottom-up signaling says, uh-oh, something unexpected happened, you better pay attention to that and notice it. And then you can modify your top-down response. In ADHD, what we seem to see is a breakdown in this top-down control and an excess of bottom-up response. This could be emotional reactivity in this particular slide, but it can also be attentional response. You can have attentional capture here, or you can have emotional capture. And so the result is that the child can in fact get captured by attention by a video game, but not override that when it's time to stop the video game. They can, on the other hand, not focus their attention on schoolwork because they haven't got the top-down control to overcome the bottom-up distractions around them. So this top-down, bottom-up balance is a helpful way to think about how self-regulation works and how it can break down in ADHD. All right, let's think about that now in terms first of attention and then in terms of emotion, both of which influence behavior. So here's a more detailed graph that gives the same story, but now in relation to the brain circuits schematically. So on the upper left would be representing the back part of the cortex, which is the parietal cortex, and that's where a lot of sensory processing happens. A lot of attentional capture can happen here. If I notice a noise or notice somebody doing something interesting over there on the part of the room, that'll capture my attention for a moment spontaneously because it's novel, it's a change, and our brains are designed to detect that. I can overcome that if I have appropriate top-down functioning. Similarly, I can have emotional signaling coming from my limbic system in the interior of the brain, and these are all working in parallel, and of course the emotion and attention are also interacting. Emotions can capture attention, and what captures attention can trigger emotions. So this three-way dialogue is always going on between different parts of the brain. In ADHD, we think that this breaks down in some way. For example, we might see that the top-down biasing of attentional capture is weakened in ADHD, and as a result, there's extra signaling going on, interrupting deliberate attention. How would we know this? How might we see this? Well, let's ask what the evidence is on this. This is where the brain imaging comes in, and we can look either at the functioning of these actual areas of the brain or at their connections. And a key part of it, first of all, is the functioning. So here's a meta-analysis results. It summarizes the result from dozens of studies that have put children in an MRI scanner and asked them to do an attention task and then asked how their brains respond. And what you're seeing here are subtraction diagram. So these pictures are just projecting the data onto a brain to approximate where the signal was different. And these are relative changes. So the red areas show that the brain area of the ADHD child did not activate as much. There was not as much blood flow to that part of the brain, which implies there was not as much neural activity during the attention task. And in fact, what we see here is, you can see in the lower right, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to the right, the DLPFC, and the parietal lobe. Those are closely connected parts of that frontal parietal attention network, and that the whole network is functioning poorly in both ends. And similarly, we can see that the basal ganglia, which is supposed to be involved in signaling important emotional stimuli or important novelty relevant to the task, is under functioning. And so these attention networks appear to be not operating fully on attention tasks in ADHD. And this is increasingly now a consensus finding, because this is pooled across all the data in the field, across not hundreds, but probably dozens of studies, hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands of children. And so a fairly robust finding. This is different in children overall when you average across all children with ADHD. This doesn't mean you can see this in every single child, but it means that as a group you can pick up this signal. However, we also are seeing, when we look at the fibers connecting these regions, so this diagram illustrates the particular long fibers, long axons that project back and forth from the prefrontal cortex to the parietal cortex. And you have both a red, a yellow, and a green projections there. Those are the distinct ventral and dorsal attention circuits in the brain. And we can use a brain imaging technique called diffusion tensor imaging to look at the integrity of those axonal fibers. And what we have noticed in our research, and this is also now seen in other meta-analyses, is that particular those yellow fibers are underdeveloped in ADHD children as a group, suggesting that that explains part of why we're seeing the underfunctioning in those front and back areas of the attention network, is because they're not very well connected. They're not talking to each other, and the reason they're not doing that in part is that the white matter, that myelin sheath, is underdeveloped. It's not functioning as well. It's probably not as thick or as fully developed in children with ADHD, and this is part of what we're seeing going wrong. And this explains why, in part, why they don't focus very long on what they should, because their attention gets captured by something else, because there's not enough crosstalk with that goal-directed part of the attention network, and so the back of the brain is capturing attention too much. And similarly, when they're on the video game, they get sucked into it and can't tear away because they've been captured by that back part of the brain, and the front part of the brain can't quite override it because there's not a strong enough signal. They're still operating on a weak telephone line instead of on a strong fiber optic connection to make that nice clear signal. The same story comes up for impulsivity. So I just talked about attention and the top part of the network. Now we can look at that bottom part of the network. We can think about capture by a reward signal or a fear signal. And here they're called emotion signals, but that means excitement or reward, motivation, or it means anxiety or fear motivation. And in this slide, you can see that that's underdeveloped. I've shown a dotted line for the frontal cortex of the back, illustrating that that's an underdeveloped signal, allowing that bottom-up signal to be strong and to capture attention and to capture behavior, so behavior doesn't get suppressed. So here's where we see a problem with response inhibition. And this is a similar meta-analysis now showing the results for children with ADHD when they have to inhibit a motor response. And here we see a particular breakdown under response in specific circuits in the inferior frontal cortex down there in the lower right in the insula, as well as in the thalamus, which is a very important part of signaling that you have to stop a behavior that you were doing, and that connects to the insula. And you also see problems in the supplemental motor area. Notice that on the upper part of the slide, the front is to the left, and on the right, the front is to the right. So those are kind of like the brain has been peeled in the middle and split both ways. So it's opened up from the inside there, and you're seeing that interior surface of the brain and how those supplemental motor areas in anterior cingulate cortex are under-functioning. This is a classic circuit for response inhibition, not functioning normally in ADHD children when they fail to inhibit a response. And this is why we see children blurt out in class, because that ability, once you start a response, once you start to blurt out, most of us, if we start to blurt something out, but then we notice the other person is not smiling, we can interrupt it at the last split second. The average adult only needs about 200 milliseconds of warning, and they can interrupt something they're about to do even if they've started to do it. The average child needs a little bit more time, maybe 280 milliseconds, but the ADHD child needs a little longer. They need about 20 or 30 longer milliseconds of warning, and that's an eternity when it comes to second-by-second behavioral control. And so they blurt out in class. They're just a half step behind with that signaling socially, that half step behind with processing what happened, and therefore they blurt out. And so this helps us explain the kind of impulsive response. All right, what about emotion? One of the questions we talked about often with parents is, my child has such anger outbursts, they have so much anxiety. Is it really ADHD or is it something else? Well, sometimes it is another disorder, but also emotion regulation is a major part of ADHD that's often been neglected. And the reason for that is that top-down control is also involved directly in these emotion responses, both negative emotion on the right, which can be fear-based anger or fear-based withdrawal, or on the left, which can be excitement, excess drive toward a goal, or frustration anger, where I don't get my goal and I fly into rage because I didn't get what I wanted. And so these two kinds of anger, as well as these two kinds of approach or avoidance, are regulated also by top-down control during development. And when that doesn't develop properly, these bottom-up systems get kind of running without interruption. And one possibility is breakdown on the negative emotions, as here illustrated on the right by the red lines showing a very strong bottom-up signaling and very weak top-down signaling. And this is probably a connection between the insula and the amygdala, a key part of that negative emotion regulation circuit. And in fact, is there any evidence for this? There is. Here's an illustration of results that came out a couple of years ago from the group at NYU, showing that in fact the amygdala-insula connection functionally is reduced in children with ADHD, and it's a little hard to see on this compressed slide, but what you're seeing here is that the red, green, and blue highlighting, especially in the bottom part of the diagram there, those are showing that the areas of the brain that should be correlated with the amygdala in terms of their functional activation in ADHD kids. And what this is showing is that the more emotional dysregulation the child has, the more elability or emotional variability and unpredictability they have, the less connection there is between the amygdala and the insula, which is the circuit that should help modulate those emotional outbursts. So this helps us to understand why that's happening, that those brain circuits are very weakly developed. They're not coordinating well functionally, and we do this by looking at coactivation of those brain areas in the magnet. At the same time, we can ask about the appetitive approach, the positive reward response, which is a tendency to either appropriately respond to reward, and typically what we see in ADHD is they only respond to reward if it's immediate, and then they over-respond, but they under-respond if it's a later reward. They don't remember that future reward, and they don't value it very well. So that reflects potentially a breakdown in this regulatory system between the approach system, and this is very much involved in the nucleus accumbens, which is also called the anterior striatum, and a different area of the prefrontal cortex. And so this has also been looked at, and our group showed good results here using a similar design last year. And here you see that exactly what we see here, that this reward circuit, the nucleus accumbens, is the seed region, and you can see when you just look at the very top, the controls show a lot of connectivity to that whole prefrontal cortex there, showing there's a massive dialogue or connection between the prefrontal cortex and the reward based in the amygdala. In ADHD, you can see that that activation is very much reduced, especially in the dorsal part of the prefrontal cortex, where there's no color highlighting there. And when you look at the subtraction down at the bottom, you see that, in fact, there's a significant difference there in that prefrontal cortex connectivity for the ADHD kids, where the controls are much more connected than the ADHD kids are. So there's also a number of other findings here, but this just highlights that, in fact, we do see this breakdown in the reward circuit, and this could explain overexcitement. It could also explain frustration, anger in kids with ADHD based on immaturity of these connections. I want to conclude by pointing out what I think all of you may be noticing is that kids with ADHD are not all the same. So you might say, well, my child isn't anxious, but they sure do get mad a lot. Or, gee, my child doesn't get angry, but they worry all the time. Or they don't have any problem with their emotions, but they just can't pay attention. And in fact, that's right. ADHD kids are quite variable, and we've now begun to demonstrate this using empirical methods to let the computer naturally cluster kids according to their similarities. And so this is just one example I'll show you of recent work we've done on this that we've validated with brain imaging. This is just the behavioral data, though. And these are 3 groups of ADHD kids. There's 500 kids in total here, 300 of them with ADHD. On this graph, just to orient you, the purple line in the middle is normal. We've scaled everything here to the kids, control kids, normal emotional behavior. The far upper left, where the red circle is, that's ADHD symptoms. So all 3 of these groups have the same level of ADHD symptoms, but they're very different in their emotional responding. And so the group in green, which we call the irritable group, they here have extremely more anger than the other groups. And these are very large differences. The block there, the green block, is the standard error bar. So these are very big differences between these groups. There's a group of kids here who get very angry, and just over to the right, the soothability graph illustrates there that they are very slow to recover. So these are our tantruming kids. They are a subgroup of kids with ADHD, and we showed in our brain imaging that they had different brain imaging results. At the same time, on the right-hand side, you can see this group in red. That's a group that's very, very high on approach, very excitable, very active. They might be very exuberant, may not be as angry, but they're very exuberant and very outgoing, and they're a different profile. And so there are different profiles of kids. The blue group there seems like they have pretty normal emotional responding. They're just inattentive. And so we really do have meaningful subgroups of ADHD kids, and that's part of why we're getting these different results that we're seeing as different scanning studies. All right, let me wrap up here so we have some time for questions. So first of all, the message I want to get across here is that ADHD is not so much a breakdown in one brain spot. It's not a hole in the head in one area, so to speak, but it's a breakdown in the connectivity. It's a breakdown in the communication networks in the brain. It's an immaturity of these networks. They're not developing rapidly, or they're not developing fully. And these brain networks are interrelated around emotion, attention, behavior, and arousal. So that kids with ADHD are having trouble with global self-regulation, just regulation of attention. And that's why we see breakdowns in attention as well as emotion, and part of why clinicians sometimes get very confused, or it becomes very ambiguous whether the primary problem is emotion or ADHD. The key circuits here that we covered, just for your review, are frontal cortex parietal circuits that involved in attention and arousal, as well as subcortical circuits involved in emotion and behavior and vision. I didn't talk about the brain chemicals here, but these circuits are populated by very important brain chemicals that you've heard about before: dopamine, norepinephrine, and glutamate in particular. And most of the ADHD medications that are on the market are involved in some way with these brain chemicals to try to alter functioning in these circuits. And that increasing new direction in the field is the focus on the white matter, the myelin sheath, rather than the gray matter. And this is kind of the new direction the last few years in the field. And then finally, there's probably more subtypes of ADHD in relation to these different types of regulation. All right, let me stop there so we have time for discussion. And I want to thank you all for your interest, and I'll be happy to entertain some questions. And my understanding is that the moderator is going to feed me the questions, and then we'll take them that way.
I am indeed. Thank you. That was fascinating. I have to say that, you know, in all the years of attitude of realizing how very different profiles our families and our readers present about their children or themselves, I've never really heard a cogent explanation before of why ADHD might be such a broad spectrum of behavior. I mean, do you believe, Dr. Nigg, that ultimately we won't have such a thing as ADHD, but we'll have more of a varied diagnosis once it's better understood?
I think we will end up with hopefully with subtypes that are based on their biology and maybe
Right.
even on their cause. But I do think probably the next step will be we'll start classifying them. Right now, the classification we have, ADHD hyperactive subtype or presentation ADHD inattentive type, those are not very valid empirically, and they aren't very valid biologically. But they haven't been replaced yet because no one's been able to get a consensus. But I think we will end up before long with biological types based either on their brain imaging profiles or based on their temperament or attention profiles. And I think we're moving that direction pretty rapidly. The big challenge is their change over time, so that
Yeah.
if you do a cross-sectional snapshot of kids with ADHD and classify them based on their brain image, what you'll see a year later is that they've shifted around quite a bit. And so kind of the direction that I think we're going is there's a group of children, there's a probably 70% of kids with ADHD that you can classify pretty stably as being a certain profile biologically and behaviorally, but the other 30% are hard to classify. They tend to really fluctuate a lot. And so it may be that we have a subgroup that are quite sensitive to their environment, quite sensitive to changes in what's happening in the school or the family, and therefore they're showing lots of rapid reorganization of their behavior and even of their brain, and others that show a pretty consistent pattern, either because their environment is stably unstable or stably stable, or because they just have a more resistant system to their environment. And we already know that some children are just more responsive developmentally to what the inputs are, and others are more unresponsive developmentally. I'm not talking about their behavior response, I'm talking about their brain response,
Right.
how the
Right.
brain grows. So I do think that we'll end up with biological types. They might be ADHD type 1, 2, 3, and 4, or they might get different labels depending on that'll be more political than scientific. But scientifically, we'll certainly have I think biotypes that are better than what we have now. They won't be perfect, but they'll probably be a step forward.
It makes huge sense. It really does, because the variations are so, seriously, and to think that we could group them and make sense of the different variable types makes enormous sense. I think that the question. Sorry, go ahead.
One footnote there. One concern that often happens is that we've seen in the popular press a lot of speculative subtypes based on the brain, and those really haven't been validated yet. So what I showed you today is pretty good data, but it's still very preliminary. But it's probably better data than anything that's been in the media or in the popular books. So I really do caution listeners that if you have a clinician that tells you your child has a certain brain type, that's just speculation on the part of that. There's no solid basis yet for this in one individual child. But I do think we'll get there. But some people have leapt ahead with their intuitions, but they are merely intuitions.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. There's one group of practitioners who believe in brain scans and then type children based on those scans. Is it your belief that it's too early in the development of this knowledge to use brain scans for regular diagnosis and treatment?
I wouldn't waste your money. No, it's palm reading at this point. It's not scientific. I think it's going to get there. They might be onto something intuitively, but it's not yet validated.
Okay, so as one person said, when will brain imaging become part of the diagnosis? It sounds like it's 10 or 15 years away. I'm just guessing based on what you're saying.
I think so. I mean, I think we're going to get there in the research lab, maybe before that, but the translation at the clinic is going to require new technology, because one of the problems we have now is that you tend to think that brain scanning is so reliable, but brain scanners vary a lot. If you put the same child in a different scanner, you scan them here in Oregon, but then we go and scan them in New York, even on the same model, even on the same Siemens 3T scanner, you get a lot of variation in that brain scan just from the machine differences. And so getting that standardized and knowing what a normal scan looks like is going to be a massive undertaking. I think it's starting to happen. The NIH has now put in place a study of 10,000. They want to get 10,000 brain scans over time of developing children over the next 10 years. And once those are in place, I think we'll be ready to create, national norms for a scan, and also norms for how to translate across scanners. And the other piece that has to happen technologically is what we call field deployable brain scanning, where you really can put a scanner everywhere. Right now, it's so expensive to run these brain scans that it's just not possible in most places. But if you get to the point where you can put a helmet on somebody and get their brain scan, which I think the technology should get there eventually, maybe within a decade, maybe less, then it'll become very feasible. But unfortunately, this is one of those things that's always just a year away, and never gets there.
Right. Well, it's important for people to know, though, that at this point, brain asking their physician for an MRI or investing in that is probably not a helpful tool, but that it may be at some point down the road.
It's an academic, but it won't change the treatment plan.
Right. But do you, in your practice, do you vary the treatment plan based on your own sense of the kinds of types that you see? You know, the very angry ADHD or the person who's more emotionally reactive. Do you as a practitioner?
As a practitioner, I'm very much a believer in treating the functional impairments.
Okay.
And so, if the child's functional impairment is angry tantrums, that's what we'll address in the treatment. If their functional impairment is they can't get organized with their homework, then that's what we'll address. Of course, for many children, it's both. So I'm a big believer in treating the functional impairments as opposed to the paper diagnosis. Although the paper diagnosis does give us a framework for understanding why we're seeing these functional impairments.
And would there be different treatments for a child who's very angry versus one who has organizational issues?
Yes, there would. I mean, they might both respond to a particular pharmacological treatment, but outside of the pharmacology, with the angry child, you have to deal with all the behavioral management issues, maybe a pharmacological intervention, as well as understanding what that child is thinking about, when they're getting angry and helping them with their coping skills. And that's a slog through some counseling work as well as possibly some pharmacotherapy. With the disorganization, we now have some very better empirically based coaching, executive function coaching programs that have been developed by Howard Abacoff out at NYU and Columbia that seem quite effective for helping children get more organized with their schoolwork. This executive coaching thing was such a kind of snake oil a few years ago, but it's finally gotten standardized and systematized.
Really?
That works, and I think it's worth getting into now, especially if the practitioner has a good curriculum that they can show you. And then also you can do metacognitive training in school. So those organizational skills are a much different kind of kettle of fish.
Very different than anger.
That's right.
Fascinating. Just coming back to the science, which I think is so interesting to all of us to hear because we don't tend to hear it. If the myelin sheath is developing over time, which makes sense, or is underdeveloped, does that mean then that a child might grow out of some of their ADHD? Is that what's happening when we say that some kids in their 20s are less hyperactive? What's your feeling about?
No, I think that is one possibility. In fact, I don't know if I have the extra slides here, but there are. If you Susan put my slides back up and scroll to the very end, I think I put a slide on the development. Go back one more. Is there another one at the end? Here. And here, go back one.
Cortical maturation, yeah.
Cortical maturation. If you go back one more to the prior one, I'm sorry, backward. Let's see, there. What you see here is the rate of maturation of different brain regions over time in ADHD, and they are maturing. This happens to be a slide showing white matter development, but this is going to be related to or cortical thickness, but that's going to be related to white matter development. So what seems to be happening is a percentage of children with ADHD do seem to mature out of it, even in the teen years and then in the 20s. And then a lot of the others, what they're doing is maturing about 3 or 4 years later. So whereas the average child might show mature self-control by, 21 or 22 years of age and start to get their life organized by the mid-20s, the ADHD child might seem like they're still an adolescent until they're 30, and then they finally settle down in their 30s because their brain took a few extra years for those circuits to grow up. So there does seem to be a phenomena both of a subgroup maturing and a subgroup maturing just late as this myelin sheath develops and then the circuits come online better. but there's another group that don't seem to get better or even get worse, and so it seems there probably are going to be subgroups in terms of brain trajectory where some of them develop um, don't develop at all. There's some sort of injury in the development, and others are just developing more slowly. If you go to that following slide that shows the trajectories, it shows that there's about a 2 or 3 year lag on average for cortical thickness, which is just one index of brain maturation. So the green line to the left just shows that there's less peak cortical, they reach cortical thickness later, but they reach it on many of them reach it. So I think that is what's happening. We're seeing this. That's why a subgroup do seem to settle out of it. So we do tell some families, we don't know yet. One of the really million-dollar questions that we think we're chasing pretty hard in our studies is to predict which kids these are. That if you just kind of hold your ground and keep your child from going over a cliff, they're going to settle out of this when they get into their 20s and 30s. Versus, no, you really got to get in here and aggressively do something because your child is not the type that otherwise is going to, settle out of it. So if we can predict these in advance, we'll really be way ahead in terms of the clinical recommendations to families. Right now, we don't know which is which ahead of time.
Right. Well, really challenging. Looking forward to this research continuing. Some questions about diagnosis, and then we'll come back to treatment. We talked about brain scans, but there are some other tools that parents are asking about, or listeners are asking about. Some of physicians have recommended EEG. Is that a good idea, I guess? And then the other one is the TOVA test. Do you feel that either of those has merit in diagnosing ADHD or developing a treatment plan?
Yeah, we do have the Connor CPT, the continuous performance task, the TOVA continuous performance task. Now this system called the NIBA system has been approved by the FDA. Which claims to use EEG, brain imaging. All of these techniques are claiming to improve the confidence of the physician's diagnosis. Right. And unfortunately, and I know many of these investigators, they're very sincere in what they're doing, and they are trying very hard to make this better, and they have the right concept. I mean, this is what we need to be trying to do, but the data just aren't there to really achieve much with these yet. The one that's gotten the most press lately is this NIBA system, this EEG system. And, I've studied those data, and there's a nice exchange. If any of the listeners are able to go on Google Scholar, or Susan, I can send you these papers, and you can put them up on your webpage. But there's a nice exchange just this year between a group of EEG scientists and the NIBA developers in the literature. I mean, they published in the peer-reviewed literature their exchange. And the scientific group heavily criticized this NIBA system as just not ready, for prime time clinically, and really being oversold. And the data really are very weak that they're relying on for their FDA approval. However, you get the rebuttal from the developers. One of whom is Mark Stein, who's a respected ADHD researcher. So I think it's moving. It's a real debate, but my own opinion is I side with the EEG scientists. My own view of these data is that it's not worth the money that it's going to cost you to have this test. It may give the clinician a little more confidence in their ADHD, but what the investigators failed to show is that there's an improvement. They compared the clinician sitting down with the child and the parent, talking to the child, guessing whether they have ADHD or not, and then doing the EEG test, and now they guess more accurately with the benefit of the EEG test. But they never tested whether giving them a standardized rating scale would give you even better confidence than doing the EEG. And that's the basic question is, are these very low-cost rating scale measures which improve accuracy tremendously? We know that. We know from the literature that if you give a proper battery of parent-teacher standardized normative rating scales and properly put those together using the DSM algorithm, your accuracy gets very high compared to expert consensus gold standard. And none of these tests have shown that the EEG outperforms or improves upon that. They only show that it helps the clinician who's just sitting there in his chair talking to you, that it helps him from that point of view, which it makes sense that it would. But it doesn't show you that a cheaper alternative is just as good. And that's what I'd like to find out. And that's what I believe we'll be able to get there with some of these lower cost tests. And I do believe things like the TOVA, the CPT, and probably even the EEG test eventually will be helpful. But I think it's still very early days, and given the cost of these things, the CPTs are not expensive. I don't see any harm. We give those sometimes, not as a proof, just as one more piece of about a dozen things we look at in the cumulative information about that child. But as long as the clinician is willing to say, I got to look at a dozen data points on this child, I've got to put together the teacher input, the parent input, the child input, maybe a couple of tests that I do, my own observations. I got to figure out how to weight that stuff. As long as it's recognized that these are not diagnostic tests, but they're one more piece of information that can inform the clinician, then it's okay to use them. But the mistake is to think this is going to tell us, this is going to take away the clinician's judgment, answer it like a blood test. It just can't do that.
Right. So at the end of the day, and we've heard this repeatedly, you need to find a clinician who will take the time to really figure things out and not look for a quick answer, is what I think we're hearing over and over again.
At the end of the day, there's no shortcut. Yeah.
Right. Questions about brain training, neurofeedback. Is there any way, I think is the essence of the question, to strengthen the brain connections or train them to work more effectively, quote?
Boy, that's what everybody wants to get.
Yeah. I know.
And here again, what we see is that some of these claims, there's a big paper in Nature a couple years ago from the UCSF group. There's a number of publications now on this CogMed group by Nordal Klingberg in Sweden. Again, these are serious scientists that are really trying hard to develop appropriate interventions. They are getting there, but these things have been oversold and premature. Yes, they do improve the brain connections a little bit, but do they do so better than going out and taking a walk, than eating a good diet, than getting a good night's sleep? That's what hasn't been demonstrated. And I think what the consensus, again, and I can send you these papers too, Susan, there's again a scathing critique from a large body of neuroscientists from Stanford and MIT, wrote a consensus letter 2 years ago, just scathing condemnation of some of the claims made for these computer training programs, because of this problem that they claim to grow the brain compared to doing nothing, but they don't show that you can grow the brain better than just doing healthy things. Are you better off spending half an hour doing brain training, or are you better off spending half an hour taking a walk? Both of those things are going to grow your brain. And we know that exercise grows the brain dramatically in children.
Really?
And so the strongest advice I give parents, if you want to grow your child's brain, especially their executive networks, get them to a lot of exercise. It's amazing what it does for brain growth. And those data are robust and very dependable and very real, and they're replicated over and over in animals and in humans. And so we really know that you grow the brain, you grow executive functioning, you grow these networks by exercise, especially exercise with complex motor learning involved in it. So I'm sending parents now to tell your child, get aerobics, go do taekwondo, go do dance, go do something where there's complex motor learning and aerobic challenge, and that really helps the brain grow. And it makes sense anatomically, because we look at how the brain develops, especially in young children, but even throughout childhood. It really develops partly by motor activity, because it's by moving through the world that we as animals, that we learn about the world, not by thinking about it, but by going out there and engaging with it. And so what the computer is doing is simulating real-world experience and challenging the brain, but real-world experience is probably still even better, kind of.
Right.
And so I think what I would strongly encourage parents is to pay attention to exercise, to healthy nutrition, to sleep. These are the big three of, and to stress. Reduce your child's stress level. If the home is a war zone, get the counseling and reduce that tone it down at the home. If the child has been traumatized, get therapy for that. If the child isn't getting sleep, if they're not getting healthy food, not getting exercise, those three or four things they're really the foundation of healthy brain growth, and those are very well documented. And part of what we see in our ADHD population is they're not getting these basics of brain growth. And then, so I would strongly encourage listeners, don't go spend money on brain training if you aren't getting good exercise, good nutrition, good sleep. Those things are going to be much more effective at growing the brain. That said, I don't want to rule out, the data aren't there yet. We had a major review, again, I can send you these articles. The Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Clinics of North America did a nice special issue on alternative treatments for ADHD, and the expert authoritative review of the brain training at that time concluded it's not there yet. It's still not convincing, but it's getting close. It was in the category of possibly efficacious. So
what's the citation to that? The Child and Adolescent?
Child and Adolescent Psychiatric Clinics of North America, October 2014 edition is a special issue, and that's free online if you Google it. And so you can see the review there, and that was 2 years ago. So again, I think this, I'm not saying people shouldn't do it and that it won't work for some people, but it's just not quite convincing as far as the other things you could be doing that are cheaper. And so I give it 5 years, and we might be there. I think same thing with neurofeedback. It's close. It might get there, but they've got a ways to go to prove that it's better than these alternative ways of spending the hour.
Okay, makes sense. Can we talk about medication? How do both the stimulants and the non-stimulant medications for ADHD work on the brain, given the brain that you've described with weak brain connections?
Essentially, what they're doing, if you can go to back to my extra slides, I believe the first post slide. One more. Here. Back. There you go. This one here. What this is showing is the on the upper left there, the dopamine circuit in blue, and then the red on the right is the norepinephrine circuit. And those two, what the stimulant medications do is they wake up those circuits. They get those circuits activated. They get them going. Those circuits are kind of asleep, and the stimulant medications wake them up, and that basically, by waking up the red circuit, the norepinephrine circuit, it improves the signal-to-noise ratio. It kind of quiets down the noisiness of the brain, if you will, or the noisiness of the environment, so that you can focus on one thing and really not be constantly distracted. You talk to the people with ADHD, and they have this experience that the whole world is constantly 10 people shouting at them at once. They just can't filter it out. It's being at a party and trying to listen to 5 people talking at once, and you can't hear any of them. And that's kind of the everyday world for a lot of people with ADHD. They can't separate the signal from the noise. And this helps that happen by dampening that down. And similarly, the blue circuit, the dopamine circuit, it separates out what's important from what's not important. So what I care about right now is the teacher, and suddenly the teacher gets bigger and louder, and I don't care about what's outside. And so it makes the goal-directed stuff much more salient. And so those two things together really help focus attention and improve self-regulation for kids with ADHD. So that's the primary way the stimulants work. The non-stimulants work on either by putting more emphasis on the norepinephrine circuit. That's the way guanfacine works, but a lot of the others, there's some newer ones that are trying to work on other neurotransmitters that aren't shown here, in particular glutamate, and that's going to be very, very interesting because part of what the dopamine does, and you see it in kind of the fine print up there, these NMDA inputs that it mentions in that upper box on the left, those are glutamate receptors. And when we look at the genetics of ADHD, a lot of what is popping up there that's really interesting is the glutamate genes. And so the pharmaceutical companies now are getting very interested in glutamate, and I think that's probably where we're going to see alternative medications. I think we already are, in fact, starting to see that in some of the alternatives. And so what we might have is a second route in there through glutamate. But the primary route is to do something with these catecholamines, something with dopamine or norepinephrine primarily. The antidepressants work on serotonin uptake inhibitors, and serotonin is not shown here, but serotonin is very important for stabilizing that top-down regulation as well. And so, again, getting that system working more efficiently and sort of centering it, it's off-center, centering that system. So really these key neurotransmitter systems are being woken up by these drugs.
Interesting. And how about the Strateras and the non-stimulant medications?
Well, they vary, but again, the stimulants are primarily hitting the dopamine and a little bit the norepinephrine. The Stratera and the others are going to hit some of these other, the norepinephrine and some of the other serotonin circuits. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned two types of dysregulation. I think the attentional dysregulation, but also the emotional. On the emotional side, one person, for example, in the webinar said that her child's physician assumed that the emotional ability was suggested bipolar disease.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the emotional side of ADHD? It's something that many of our readers are just beginning to understand, and it's not part of the traditional diagnosis of inattentive hyperactivity.
Yeah, it's increasing. Yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Sorry.
No, yeah, it is a major point of confusion. It's probably the most frequent question I get asked by clinicians when I'm asked to consult with psychiatrists and pediatricians is what about all the emotionality? Does this child have an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder or mania or what? And the bipolar thing is a particular hornet's nest. The King's College in London and the Maudsley Center, the Maudsley Hospital in London sees hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of children coming in with behavior problems, ADHD, and they did a series of nearly 1,000 children who presented with temper tantrums and emotional outbursts. And then they examined those children over time to see how many of them developed mania and how many of them actually had manic symptoms. And it was I think less than 10. I think it was less than 1% or maybe 2% of the kids who have tantrums. And so most of those kids with tantrums do not have bipolar. They have got a mood regulation problem that puts them at risk for depression, but not at risk for bipolar very much. To have bipolar, you have to have mania. You have to have this grandiosity, this elevated mood, and so on, and this break from normal as far as your energy level. The tantrums themselves, especially when they're chronic tantrums, that just less than a day long, if it lasts for 3 days, that's different. But if it lasts less than a day, a few hours to a few minutes, even if it's every day, if it's steady, if that's that child all the time, that's their whole life, that very rarely will that be bipolar. That is more likely an incipient depression or an incipient mood disorder in that child. However, I will point out that this is still an area that's a hot topic, a lot of controversy in this area. We know that bipolar has been overdiagnosed. We still don't know what we're missing in some of these kids. There are trials going on now at NIMH to try different medications for these kids with these severe explosive syndromes. They probably are very, very severe ADHD, but there may be buried in there, or ADHD plus mood disorder, probably depression. But there may be a subgroup that are being missed, but they're a very, very small group, we think, with any kind of bipolar. So usually we advise the clinicians, and Susan and I talked beforehand, I'll tell the listeners that we'll try to get you guys a link to that NIMH websites in case they're still enrolling. But what we advise parents and clinicians is consider a mood disorder and an antidepressant before you leap to bipolar with these kids with tantrums, because that's what the long-term follow-up studies are showing. These kids develop depression but not mania.
All right, that's really interesting. Well, there's just general gratitude to you for this logical approach. Listeners are just very interested in hearing what's going on in the ADHD brain. And general question about, are there books or articles that you would recommend to those listening who would like to know more about the ADHD brain?
Yeah, there are some good summary reviews. Let's correspond back channel, Susan, and we can maybe put something up on the webpage. I have a couple of good articles. There's some good reviews out there in the literature that are, and we can kind of vary them. For readers that have some biological background, there's some nice reviews that kind of leap in with the more details, but I think there's also some good high-level ones that are going to orient everybody, no matter what your background is. So let me dig up a couple. We can put them on the webpage for people.
That's great, and we're out of time. And thank you, Dr. Nigg. Your work you're doing is so important, and we're really grateful that you shared it with us today. Thank you all for listening, and don't forget next Thursday, the summer slide, back to school days, parent strategies with Ann Dolan, who's always great. As well as school organization with Susan Lasky. So that's part of our Success at School series. And this ends really our clinician series. It was super helpful. Dr. Nigg, I'll be in touch with you by email. And I thank you so much all for listening. Look for more information on attitudemag.com/webinars. We'll add some of the links that Dr. Nigg has suggested. Thanks again, and we're signing off. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.